delighted to see you all here and delighted to be hosting this event. I'm Jack Petranker. I'm the director of Mangalam Research Center for Buddhist Languages, and I suppose I should sit where there's a microphone. Okay. If anybody has trouble hearing, let us know, but I'm assuming we're okay. So let me tell you a little bit about Mangalam Research Center and then a little bit about this conference, and then we will launch into it. So Mangalam Research Center was founded in 2009. We acquired this building in 2008 and spent the better part of a year renovating it and making it suitable for our purposes. And there are other activities that go on in this building, but the primary activity really is the Mangalam Research Center for Buddhist Languages. The background of Mangalam is the work that has been done by some of our sister organizations. All of our organizations were founded by a Tibetan Lama, Tartan Tulku, who came to this country in 1968, settled in Berkeley in 1969. Can you not hear me?
Right, yeah. Can the volume be turned up a little bit?
Okay, just a little bit higher on the volume. Or maybe I can get a little bit closer. How about that?
That's great.
Okay, forget about it. No need to go higher on the volume. Just make Jack sit closer to the microphone. So Tartan Tulku, after arriving and settling in this country in 1969, founded a number of different organizations with Berkeley as the headquarters, and since then we've moved some of those operations to Sonoma County. That's now the home of Dharma Publishing, and we have a retreat center up there, Ratnaling Retreat Center, and also a Buddhist center where long-term students live, Odeon Center. But the connection for Mangalam research is especially through the texts. Tartang Rinpoche and his students have worked for over 40 years to preserve and transmit the teachings, and most of that work for many years now has been focused on preserving the teachings in Tibetan, and a lot of that in the last 20 years has been actually typesetting and printing texts and then sending them over to India for distribution to the Tibetan community. And over that time, we've given away more than 3 million books, so it's a really massive undertaking. And Mangalam really grows out of that, because on the one hand, you can say, well, let's make sure that the texts are preserved in Tibetan so that the lamas, the monks, the nuns, the kempos, the learned masters really can work with those texts. But the next step, once you've dealt with that concern, and it's ongoing, I'm not saying we're all done with that now, but the next step is to find ways to bring the Buddhist teachings into Western languages. And that's partly for the sake of the Westerners, but it's also for the sake of the Dharma, because English in particular, and that's where we're focusing now, is the global language. And if the Dharma, if Buddhism is to survive, it really has to be carried forward in English and then also in other Western languages. And finding the right vocabulary, the right language for doing that is a tremendous challenge. People have been translating Buddhist texts for well over a century now, but we are still in the infancy of that process. Yesterday on the conference that we held, we talked a little bit about how that process took place in China, where Buddhism came into a country with a very strong tradition of its own, very strong philosophical understanding and well-developed vocabularies. And it took centuries. It took centuries to really find the right language, the right way to do it. And Mangalam Research Center aims to do something similar to that for English and other Western languages, or at least to create the resources, to do the research that will make it possible to to really feel as confident as we can that we have transmitted without distortion, without diminution, the inherent meaning of the Buddha's teachings and the teachings of the great masters and all the Buddhist traditions that followed from that. So our research, especially in these first few years, has been very much focused on clarifying the meaning of the texts as they've been used in the tradition. But then again, there's another side to that. And the other side to that is honoring and making use of and finding the right bridge to the resources that we have available here in the West. And that means going into our own traditions and also really the shared traditions of all cultures to investigate the possibilities for a language and of course on the heels of that language, the experiential realization that can, again, communicate the heart of the teachings. So this conference that we held a conference yesterday, and this panel and workshop are a follow-up. This is a kind of an interesting new beginning for us, because for the first time we're reaching out to other religious traditions. And we're saying, well, what can we learn from each other? Really, our focus is always going to be on the language. So what can we learn from each other in terms of the language of meditation, in this case, because that seemed like a great place to start. And I have to say that having participated in the conference yesterday, it was really a wonderfully illuminating experience to hear from representatives of different traditions. And I think, I see that as a beginning, a first step, and I don't know for sure what the second step is going to be, but there will be one, and we will continue to develop that. Well, I suppose I do know what the second step is. It's this panel discussion here today. So here's an opportunity for us to reflect together and share with you some of the themes that we've been exploring, some of the possibilities that have opened up and that will continue to open. So I'm really glad you can join us and share in this, just keep in mind that the possibilities are limitless. So when you leave here today, you may return, you may not, but in some way I hope that the pathways that have been opened, the doors that we've at least been able to see through the mists, continue to open. So that's our goal today. The panel discussion is going to go until 2:30. The format we're using is that people will take a few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, to share some of their thoughts, each of the panelists, and then we'll have some discussion among ourselves, open it up to you, and I'm sure it'll be a great exchange. And then, as you know, there's going to be a workshop that starts at 3 o'clock and runs from 3 until 6, and we hope that a number of you are going to stay on for that. And 3 of our panelists, who are also practitioners, will be sharing some meditation approaches from their own traditions. And I think that'll be a great embodied, living dialogue, which will add a lot to what we're doing. So let me very quickly introduce the panelists. So let's see, I'm going to have to go in order here. So Carl McColman is sitting next to me. He's a Catholic. He's in the tradition of the Cistercian movement and is a lay Cistercian of Our Lady of the Holy Spirit, which is a community that's under the guidance of the Trappist order. And I found it very interesting to talk to Carl about how that lay community is developed, because it's an ongoing question for our community, the community of people who work within the Nyingma organizations, of which this is one. So I look forward to learning more about that. Carl has written a book called The Big Book of Christian Mysticism, and a number of other other books, and works in the field of the mystical and contemplative dimensions of Christian spirituality in particular. He received his training at the Shalem Institute for Spiritual Formation and at the Institute for Pastoral Studies, and that was an interesting coincidence because the Shalem Institute was founded by Reverend Tilden Edwards, who studied with Tartan Tulku back in the 1970s, and there was a very fruitful exchange there. So it was nice to see that coming full circle. Eleanor Roche is a professor in the graduate school in the Department of Psychology at the University of California at Berkeley, and she works on the intersections between psychology and religious contemplative practices, particularly Buddhist meditation and mindfulness practice. And yesterday she was talking about mindfulness. I don't know if that's the plan for today, but we will find out.
Not my plan.
Your plan is the plan. Okay, let's see. Robert Buswell holds the Irving and Jean Stone Endowed Chair in Humanities and is a distinguished professor of Buddhist Studies in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of California down south. In Los Angeles, you see. He's the author of a number of full-length books and scholarly articles. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia of Buddhism and is the co-editor of the forthcoming Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism. He's received the Manhei Grand Prize in Korea in recognition of his pioneering contributions to establishing Korean Buddhist studies in the West. So we're very happy to have him here. And Alan Godlass is Associate Professor in the Department of Religion at the University of Georgia, where he teaches Arabic, Islamic Studies, and world religions. He has a background in ecological psychology and Gestalt therapy, and reading that makes me add another layer of sense to what you were saying at dinner last night about how you go about teaching Islam in Georgia, which one might think could be a little bit challenging. He studied Persian in Tehran. He studied Arabic in Cairo. He specializes in the study of Quranic commentary, Hadith, Islamic spirituality, the Sufi tradition, and consciousness transformation, and practices in the Sufi tradition. And again, I discovered just yesterday that Alan also studied with Tartan Tulku back in the 1970s. So that was another coincidence. I live in a community here in Berkeley, in a building that houses members of our community, and Alan explained that he had actually helped pave the driveway where I live. So strange connections come up. Okay, I've spoken certainly long enough. Let's go ahead and start with you, Carl.
Okay. So just a brief statement now to get us started. Well, first of all, thank you, Jack. It's just a tremendous honor and a privilege to be here, and thank you all for being here today. As Jack mentioned, I am a practitioner in the Catholic tradition, and believe it or not, there really is a contemplative tradition within Christianity, within Catholicism in particular, although it is certainly a marginal tradition. And in my presentation yesterday, one of the lines that I traced was how that marginalization really became accelerated with the rise of modernity after the Reformation and the modern era. We live in a time when contemplative practice is undergoing a revival within Christianity, and of course, ironically, that is to a great extent due to interfaith dialogue and interspiritual exploration. As I mentioned, we don't really call them root teachers in Christianity, but if I had a root teacher, it would be Tilden Edwards, who his root teacher is Tartan Tulku. So it's kind of an interesting, again, kind of track there. And many of you are probably familiar with Thomas Keating, who worked with a Zen priest back in the 1980s. Thomas Merton, probably the most famous Catholic contemplative of recent history, was very much engaged in interfaith work, had spent some time with the Dalai Lama. I think he corresponded with Thich Nhat Hanh and was actually in the East at the time of his untimely death in 1968. And there are a number of other figures. There's B. Griffiths and Abhishek Tananda. I could go on and on, but it's fascinating that this period, especially beginning in around the mid-20th century, when various number of Christians, and primarily monastic Christians, not exclusively, but primarily monastics, reached out to other faith traditions and really found meaning in spiritual practice there. But then the other part of that story was, especially with the Second Vatican Council in Catholicism, there was a movement called ressourcement, or returning to the sources, a theological movement initially that that involved really trying to regain the wisdom of the fathers of the church or of the great mystics from antiquity into the early Middle Ages. And that also really led to a reclaiming of a contemplative tradition that goes back to the desert of Egypt and Syria in the 3rd and 4th centuries. It's a very kind of exciting time to be a contemplative within Christianity. But the other issue that I addressed in my paper yesterday, and I think the papers, we're going to try to make those available online. Is that the plan, Andrew? Is that?
We'll discuss that.
Okay, well, if you don't do it, I will.
Certainly maybe we'll just ask individual authors. Some of the papers we got were drafts, not really for circulation.
Well,
So I think we'll do it on a case by
But
case basis.
we'll make sure my paper's available if anyone's interested in getting the full-length story. But
It was a great paper.
thank you. But the
Or you can read his books.
there you go. Well, which I don't have with me, so I can't really hawk them to that. But, they're on Amazon. But in the paper, we really look at how the language within Christianity has really been changing, particularly within the last 75 to 100 years, and some of that change has very much been a result of the interfaith dialogue. And to just give you a very brief example, and then I'll kind of wrap up so that the other panelists can speak. Historically, within Christianity, the word meditation really referred to a discursive act. Really, it was basically meditating on the life of Christ, or meditating on his passion, or meditating on a passage from Scripture. And what you see beginning really around 1960, around the time that the interfaith dialogue was really heating up within Christianity, is the emergence of the use of meditation more as it's commonly understood, referring to, I guess for lack of a better term, a non-discursive practice, or a practice that would be oriented towards a mantra or some other means of entering into awareness, or entering into silence, I guess for lack of a better term. Meanwhile, contemplation, historically within Christianity, has been more of a term oriented towards that kind of non-discursive, really embracing silence as an act of affective or heart-centered beholding of the divine mystery, or God. And so it's very interesting. I was speaking yesterday about how I'm in dialogue with a meditation teacher from the Shambhala tradition in Atlanta, and we kind of laugh about how the words meditation and contemplation in Shambhala Buddhism are used in exactly the inverse as they are in at least in historical Catholicism, although like I say, the waters have become a little muddy within recent years. So there you go. When we talk about the language of meditation, I mean, right away we can see that there's a lot of ambiguity, and words seem to have a variety of connotations and of different usages. I mean, even within one tradition. So it's quite an interesting puzzle. So at any rate, that's who I am, and
So if can you hear me? Or it just the world is in a mess, and people are amazingly oriented towards being good. From the time that an infant emerges, in fact, even before, it's sociable. It's oriented towards connecting with people. And certainly from the time it emerges, psychology has shown it's busy figuring out causes and effects. How does the world work? And parents are working at earning a living and taking care of the baby. And people help each other much more than they don't. It just doesn't get in the papers. And people are also trying to do the best they can in situations. And somehow this seems to have a blowback, both personally often and certainly socially, culturally in the world, where problems are increasing rather than being solved. The more good things that we do. So what the contemplative, meditative traditions of the world seem to offer is a way to get beyond the problem-solving mode that we all have, that doesn't seem to actually be doing a macro-solving job. Einstein said, problems can never be solved with the same minds that created them. And so my background, with a confession time, is in Shambhala Buddhism. I started out with Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the Tibetan teacher, and that has, after his death and a number of years, has become, he founded Shambhala, and that's become the Shambhala that's here, with not only a person transforming agenda, but a society and world transforming modus or inspiration behind it. After his death, I started, I spent a number of years wandering into other traditions. So I did a couple of years with a Sufi group that's based in Northern California, and have always had Christian leanings, so centering prayer and such. So I'm stretched, and am at this point back with Shambhala, which actually is not just another form of Buddhism, but encompasses, aims to encompass other religions as well. And in all of this, and in being in the psychology department, doing, the psychology thing, the only thing that I have found that seems to offer any actual getting a new mind that hasn't created those problems and is capable of really getting out of the box and seeing from a different perspective, is the contemplative traditions that the religions of the world offer. Actually, the arts do also, and narrative. But that tends to be just a flash of, when you're caught up in something, and then you go away and that's it. Whereas the contemplative religious traditions are actually opening conduits and pathways and removing blinders and all of that. So the question is, about that and how to think about it. And one thing that doesn't mean is that they're all doing the same thing and they're all aiming at the same thing, and some call it God and some call it that, and some, you know. Because how can we know if we actually get out of the box and all our knowing habits are inside? So you don't have to say that. In fact, it's a good idea not to say that to start out with. But in fact, it's from yesterday, it's really wonderful to be getting different perspectives and different methods. So now I feel I should say something about mindfulness, because that's really a popular word. Yesterday I said a celebrity word and people laughed, so I'll say it again. You want to get rewarded again.
Those psychologists.
Yeah. I think I had the misfortune actually to spend part of the time trying to explain why I think that that's really a blind alley. Because while when it's described and talked about, it sounds wonderful and it sounds contemplative, the way in which it has most entered our culture, which is through a clinical program called mindfulness-based stress reduction and a variety of its clones and other programs, it actually has almost nothing really from Buddhism that within the space of the 8 weeks that it's taught that people pick up on if you actually talk to the people and see how it's done. But what it has is a potpourri of a large variety of psychological techniques, and also smidgens from other things other than mindfulness in it, all of which have their own research traditions that do people a certain amount of good, and they're kind of all put together. And so this is a case of a word run wild, where use of the word is sort of blinding people to look at what's actually in mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is perfectly good stuff from our culture and people being good as best as they can. And therefore it may block the path to people realizing the actual traditions, the set of very different traditions in Buddhism that the word comes from, if not most of the practices. Now, one of the things that psychology shows is that that's really the wrong way to go about things, because that's saying what's wrong with something. And people do much better if you start out with what works and what's right. So I began thinking, well, maybe I should just forget about it and forget the paper. And this morning I was padding around and turned on the radio. And behold, one of the major researchers in brain neurosciences of emotion and mindfulness stuff was talking. He was being interviewed. And the interviewer said, now the last neuroscientist I interviewed said, I asked him what the mind was, and he said, it's what the brain does. Do you agree with that? And Davidson says, well, yes, but I wouldn't put it that way, because what the mind does can change the brain. And the interviewer says, oh, can you give an example? And he said, well, mindfulness, and we did some research in 2003, and this is a really classical piece of research where the people did they did mindfulness meditation for 8 weeks. They did mindfulness-based stress reduction, And then we measured their brains, and the left prefrontal cortex was stronger, and their immune system was better, and so on. And that's exactly the program that doesn't actually do mindfulness. It does this wonderful potpourri of other things. So I said, oh, I guess, no. Sometimes you do have to muddle ahead walking in the mud puddles. So that's the last thing I want to say is that yes, there is life in Buddhism beyond mindfulness. And next.
I guess that's our segue.
Yes.
Now, to speak about life in Buddhism.
Well, we're going from the modern psychological analysis of meditation via mindfulness. I'm more of the Buddhist specialist. I started off actually as a monk. I was ordained in Thailand and did primarily Thai style vipassana or satipatthana meditation. Ended up in Korea, where I spent about 5 years in meditation hall there, doing primarily Korean styles of what we know in the West mostly as koan meditations. I learned in the course of my travels and my studies multiple Buddhist languages. And since our topic is language and meditation, I thought I would talk a little bit about this issue of meditation. Because in fact, if you look at any Buddhist language, from Sanskrit to Pali to Chinese to Tibetan to Japanese to Korean, there is no word that corresponds to meditation in those languages. This is a term we have made up in the West here to describe what is really a whole panoply of practices in Buddhism's plural, that range from what we might think of more as sort of ethical practices, precepts, to various kinds of contemplative or meditative exercises, and what those are and mean very dramatically across the Buddhist traditions, to a whole set of kind of reconstructions of our worldviews and understandings of this world that the Buddhists normally would call wisdom. And this is really what I think the Buddhists mean by meditation, is really this entire panoply of aspects of Buddhist spiritual culture. Jack Petranker in his paper yesterday talked about bhavana as being perhaps the closest analog to what we think of as meditation. I think that's actually a pretty good analogy. Bhavana very literally means cultivation, practice, or very literally it comes from a root bu in Sanskrit, which means to be, and bhavana is a form of something like bringing into being or developing, cultivating, practicing something. I often tell my students that really what Buddhism is involved in is an attempt to kind of refashion completely the person's way of thinking of themselves and the way in which they interact with their world. And this means, first of all, to do this, one has to, again, change the perspective. If you try to approach the problem, as Eleanor was talking about, with the same set of predispositions and understandings, you're not going to change. So you have to start changing. The way you do this in the Buddhist system initially was to start with various kinds of ethical precepts. We don't think of Buddhism as being a particularly ethical system, perhaps, but in fact it really is. But quite differently than perhaps Christianity, the Buddhists, when they talk about ethics, it's always in terms of more kind of situational morality almost. What I mean by this is that when you take precepts in Buddhism, for example, you take what they call shiksapada, which are sort of training rules. So our precept is, I take the training rule to refrain from killing living creatures. So the point of all of this is to place a kind of a corral around the range of actions in which you allow yourself to participate or be involved in, by not killing, by not stealing, and so forth. But the goal of that is really to kind of calm the mind and to lead to a sort of restraint in the way we interact with the world around us. And this is, again, a Buddhist technical term, restraint of the senses. Indriya samvara really means learning to kind of control the way you begin to interact with the things of your world, to develop kind of concentration. And this is what I think we mostly are talking about when we in the West think of meditation. We're talking about this very specific strategy of focusing and concentrating the mind on a single meditative object. That is not the goal of Buddhism either, though. That's a tool, once again, which leads to a state of mind which we know in Buddhism as dhyana, which is something like meditative absorption. This has quite specific mental constituents that come along with that kind of concentration. That is not the goal. It's a useful tool because the mind is now completely calm, completely focused, completely attentive, and when you withdraw then from those very deep states of concentration, the mind is still suffused with that concentration, that one point it is. So even though now you're back in touch with your world again, you're back interacting with the things of your world, that calmness and that focus allows you to sort of see through the chimeric reality we normally experience in our world and see things as they actually are, as things which are subject to impermanence. They're constantly changing. Because of this, they're on some fundamental level unsatisfactory, not worth holding on to, and because they follow their own processes of arising and ceasing, because of their impermanence, there's things which are fundamentally out of our control. They're non-self. So this is kind of a very basic Buddhist way of looking at the world as a whole. One of the challenges in Buddhism, in talking about meditation though, is that this worldview also changes over time. So by the time you get to East Asia and the Zen Chan traditions, their worldview is radically different than this. The world, rather than being a place that is a place of impermanence, suffering, and non-self, the world is actually the ground upon which the multivalent interconnections that are possible to develop by having no attachment manifest themselves. And if that worldview has changed so dramatically, you can imagine too that the kinds of meditation practices that those traditions perform also will similarly change quite dramatically. And in fact, much of what we think of as Buddhist meditation, especially the grounding in mindfulness, is never talked about in the East Asian traditions. It's a word that they would not really know at all. They may have a translation for the term, but the term is never really used as part of their language in discussing meditation practice. Instead, what do you have? You have ways in which masters of their traditions have at various points in time talked about their experiences of understanding the fact that this world, because it has no self of its own, it has these multivalent levels of interconnection with everything, this kind of profound ecological vision. This suggests that what Buddhahood is this multivalent interconnections that we can perceive between ourselves and all things in the universe. If that's the case, how do you express that experience? Well, these are what the so-called koans are in Zen. These are masters who are attempting to describe to their students what this experience is like. And so you'll have a master say, what is the meaning of Zen? The tag question was, why did Bodhidharma, the founder of Zen, come to China, bringing this tradition? And the master will say, as did Jiaozhou Zongshan, cypress tree in the courtyard. Totally nonsensical response. And yet, in some real sense, he's trying to convey to his audience what his understanding is of Buddhism, what his understanding of the nature and quality of Buddhahood itself actually is. And rather than trying then to find a way to escape from a world in which we see the world governed by impermanent suffering and not self, the three marks of existence in the early mainstream system. Instead, what you see in some of these East Asian traditions is a way to sort of manifest in oneself the same kind of understanding that these earlier Sun masters have manifested themselves as well through their responses to questions. And so this is one of the fascinating things for me. I really started off in Buddhism as more of a practitioner. And when I arrived in Korea from Southeast Asia, having done primarily satipatthana practice, and my teacher put me in meditation hall. We had a 3-month retreat period, sitting 12 hours a day, and he said, your goal here is to think about, why did this master Jiaozhou Zongshan say, when a student came to him and asked, does a dog have Buddha nature or not? This master said, no, he doesn't. That answer is wrong. So why did Jiaozhou give that answer when the correct answer should have been yes. That's your task. And I sat there thinking, what is this about? This has nothing to do with Buddhism. What is this anyway? But that was in a way kind of the catalyst, both of my own sense of questioning or doubt, that is really the goal of koan practice, really wondering, how is it that things are the way that they appear to us to be? To also raising a scholarly question, how could Buddhism, a tradition that we think of as being a unified tradition, be so radically different from one tradition to the next as it moves across these cultural boundaries? And I think we're going to be seeing in the West too, the development of quite another, quite distinct tradition of Buddhism, as Buddhism in this cultural region also begins to adapt and be adapted by the new culture in which it now finds itself. I think that's partly what we're exploring in our panel, in our discussions today too.
So, let's see, can you hear me? Good. Okay, thank you for coming here.
No,
Yeah.
So, how about now? Can you hear me now?
better.
Excellent. Good. Okay, well, it's nice to come back to Berkeley. I first lived in Berkeley in 1973. And as Jack mentioned, that's when I had the opportunity also to study with Tarthang Tulku. I talked about a few lessons that I had, important lessons that I had learned from him then. I will tell you those now. Since then, I have gone very deep in Sufism and Islam. 74, I went to Iran and lived with Sufis there for 3 years and came back. But the real impetus for me in this whole journey has been to understand first, initially, what it means to surrender. And really to keep surrendering, not just once, but to continually surrender. And once I discovered this principle of surrender, which actually was in about 1971, 71 or 72, I thought, this is how I want to live. I want to learn how to consciously, at each moment, surrender. I want to learn how to make my life one in which I'm responding at each moment, as if the world is coming to me like a wave, and then my response is to receive it in a surrendering way. So receiving it gives you a little bit of a hint of what surrender is, because it's not just a passive response. To surrender involves an approach, and at the same time, it involves an openness. And even before I understood anything about Islam, I understood this is what I wanted to deepen my understanding of surrender. Lo and behold, when I met my first Muslim Sufi, and he said, if you want to go into Sufism, you have to become a Muslim. I didn't know anything about Islam then. I didn't know what we know now, that every Muslim is a terrorist. Everybody knows it. We all know things about Islam. We all know that Muslims are terrorists. I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. Then it was really a tabula rasa. But I found out very soon that literally the meaning of Islam is surrendering. And it's connected with things like peace and nice things like that. So hearing that and then thinking that what we associate with Islam now is surrender, this seems horrible. But there's actually a certain kind of virtue in that. In the sense that we're all terrorists. Think about that. Ask yourself, how are you a terrorist? Are you terrorizing consciousness? If you're not, to whatever degree we are not responding with the absolute peak of an enlightened response, to that degree we're terrorizing consciousness. Do we want to be terrorists? Of course we don't want to be terrorists. So let's be enlightened. Let's respond in an enlightening way. But if we're not, if we don't have the quality of enlightenment of a Buddha, if we don't have the quality right now, if we don't have the quality of love of Jesus, if we don't have the quality of surrender of Muhammad, we're kidding ourselves. We're actually working contrary to that, and to speak in absolute terms, we're being a terrorist. Stop it. Stop. We have to stop terrorizing consciousness, our own. Let's start with ourselves. Stop terrorizing your consciousness. Well, I don't know how I'm terrorizing my consciousness. Well, if you don't know how you're doing it, figure it out. Try to understand the harm that you're doing, the havoc that we're wrecking in existence. Well, it seems okay, even though Eleanor told us the real world is a mess, it actually, we are causing a great deal of damage at each moment. Let's stop. It's not that bad. It really is that bad. You know, we always try to avoid, and so meditation in Islam, as I talked about in my paper, in principle, in the Quran, meditation is an attitude, a broad general attitude of unconditional, responding to existence with unconditional gratitude to God. In a nutshell, responding to our consciousness, responding to consciousness in general and our consciousness of anything, responding to that with unconditional gratitude to God. That's the essence of faith. It's the essence, I would argue, the essence of meditation in Islam. Now, Sufis, over time, developed techniques for facilitating that kind of surrender, that kind of gratitude. And often those, because the techniques are interesting, there's music, there's dancing, poetry, Coleman Barks, things like Robert Bly, it's very cool. And that obscures the principle of gratitude, not to mention all the bombs and things like that. They work a lot too, to obscure it. But it boils down to something very simple. That right now, every moment that we're alive, it's as if our senses, you feel like the air on your fingers, the sense impressions that your eyes are taking in, that your ears are taking in. It's as if all of these senses are a gigantic mouth, and we're in the best restaurant in existence, the only restaurant in existence, and we are being fed incredible food for meditation. How do we digest that? How do we gain so that we're not suffering from existential indigestion. That's a first, I never thought of that term. Existential indigestion. We have to go to a course, some people go to a course to learn how to cook gourmet food. Well, we have to go to a course to learn how to eat existential food, which is to say we need to go to a meditation course. And so we kind of like fast. We have to fast from this incredible food that we're being inundated with at each instant. We have to fast from that, stick yourself in a retreat cell, in a meditation hall, in a closet, turn the lights off, and really narrow your diet. Some people, they have allergies, and they are extremely sensitive, so they have to, these days, they go in a plastic structure. Well, we kind of have to do the same thing. We need to fast from all this incredible food that we're being fed because we're all suffering from existential indigestion, and I don't mean literally fast, but eliminate a lot of these sense impressions and really slow down, close our eyes, and get back to trying to rediscover this, if you believe in God, a God-given capacity to surrender, a God-given capacity to be fed by existence. Or if you don't believe in God, it's an inherent existential capacity to be nourished at each moment. And this is the optimal moment. But to get to that place where at every moment is the optimal meditation moment, the best moment of your life, to get to that place where you can appreciate it and be nourished by it, that requires this kind of fast, existential fast that I was talking about, and making things simple, closing your eyes, getting quiet, taking it one step at a time. After a while, when you can start digesting water, so to speak, quiet, and whatever your senses are dealing with then you can add in a few vegetables, fruit, maybe even meat, and existence. And then life can be very interesting. Very interesting. So I kind of translated for you, without a lot of the Arabic and Persian and Turkish, Quran and Hadith and things like that. I'd be happy in the discussion to add in a lot of the technical terms, but I think that was a pretty good introduction.
Okay, thank you. So I forgot to introduce the last speaker. That would be me. I wasn't going to originally be part of this panel. We had some people who couldn't come for various reasons, so then I decided to invite myself to participate. And I do so wearing a different hat. So I'm also the director of an organization called the Center for Creative Inquiry. And I really speak more in that capacity here, and I just want to say a couple of things. We're going to have good lengthy time for discussion, which is great. So many of the things that people have already said are really worthy of discussion and consideration and contemplation and meditation, or whatever words we decide to use. I think I will start with a kind of a theme that showed up in several of the remarks that people made, and actually goes back to something that I was talking about yesterday, as Robert mentioned, is one of the words that can be translated as meditation in the Sanskrit tradition or the Tibetan tradition, which I'm most familiar with, is this word bhavana in Tibetan gom. And
It has to do, at the most literal level, with bringing to life. And the question is twofold. One is, why would you need to bring something to life? I mean, aren't we already alive? And what is involved? What does it even mean to somehow do more? You know, how do you add life into life? Well, the answer actually is, I think, pretty clear, and is one of the things that is characteristic of our culture in this time, and that is that we have lost the sense of being alive in a very real way. We so often feel as though something fundamental is missing from our lives, and we feel so overjoyed when we make contact with these moments where we do feel truly alive. You know, this is a term that we use, and I think everybody has a sense of it, but to say that sometimes we feel truly alive is to say that mostly we don't. And the question is, what could we do about that? I think you could talk about meditation as a way of bringing experience truly alive. And I think that's one reason that mindfulness has become popular, even if in fact it is a hodgepodge of different methods, the way it's being presented. But they all, in some ways at least, open up for a moment or for a longer period of time this possibility that we really could come back to life. And that's one aspect of meditation. But it's also true that to talk about the life of a human being is to say more than you know, we are beings who have our five senses, or in Buddhism you would add mind as a sixth sense or a sixth form of consciousness. You can come alive in how you see, you can come alive in how you hear, you can partake of this rich banquet that Alan was speaking of, and that's definitely an important element. But, and now I really take my bearings here from the Buddhist tradition, even though I'm trying to speak not so much from the Buddhist tradition, but to be a human being is to be more than that. To be a human being is to have this possibility for a complete awakening, in the Buddhist tradition, enlightenment, or in other traditions that people have been speaking about, perhaps a real awakening to the incredible riches of life, surrender to what life has to offer. I'm just riffing a little bit on what people have been saying, connecting to the truly divine. All of those possibilities are there, and meditation also is about that. Now the problem is that many of the approaches that are used in all of our different traditions, the traditions that are represented up here, were developed in a very different time, in a very different place, speaking to very different cultures, and this is something that Robert mentioned. We're going to have to find our own way. And that doesn't mean, of course, that we can't learn from the great religious traditions, and we have to. That's our most precious resource. But we also need to be able to discover what it is in our own way of being, which is so much based on the culture that we've grown up in, so that at one level, all human beings are the same. We share the same senses, we share the same capacities of mind, we share the same potential, you could say, for enlightenment, or other ways of describing these higher possibilities. But at the same time, we're really, really different in this culture. And one of the great differences is that, in fact, we have managed to seal ourselves off from this living reality that I think in other cultures was in many ways much more accessible. But there are other more positive things you could say. Eleanor said, talk about the positive, not about the negative. There are certain things, I mean, if you want to have an impact, right? Okay.
So there are certain things in our culture which you can look at and say, oh, big problem, but you can also look at them and say, well, aren't there some possibilities here? So one is that we are just steeped in the scientific tradition. We may think that we're critical of science, but it just permeates the way we think about things. And we need to find a way that you know, the positive qualities that science brings with it, this open, inquiring mind, this willingness to question. It may have its own limits, but still a willingness to question. That seems to be one of the things that we do very well. And, and then there's the quality of education. I actually wasn't going to mention this, but you know, I think Westerners are really good at math, for instance. You know, there are a lot of traditional cultures that are not particularly. They just haven't been trained in it. I mean, I've been with people from other cultures where you're eating meals and then it comes time to pay the tip and people are kind of a little embarrassed about, well, let's see, what would 15% be, you know, like that. We have our own strengths. And another, I'll mention one more and then I'll kind of try to point that in a particular direction. The other one is that we are very well trained in a kind of questioning attitude toward ordinary experience. You know, we have this incredible investment in our culture, and I mean kind of psychic investment as well as economic investment, in these tools of make-believe. You know, we grow up playing games, we grow up seeing movies and reading novels, and we're constantly steeped in the possibility that there are other alternative realities. That's actually pretty interesting. Many years ago, when I was in high school, I wrote a short story that was a science fiction story for our creative writing magazine, and they asked everybody to say something about the story, you know, one sentence that would say something about the story. And I was surprised many years later to realize that just the tiniest little bit that I'd heard about Buddhism at that time, I had a teacher in the 10th grade who was interested in Buddhism, which was remarkable this was around 1960. Nonetheless, I'd taken some of that to heart. It was interesting to me. So what I wrote about this science fiction story was, I said the ninth path is maybe. And actually, I was, you know, looking back and realizing that that's how I was thinking at the time, I thought that was pretty cool. Because I was thinking about the Eightfold Path, and what we offer in this culture is alternative possibilities, imagination, speculation, a kind of a willingness to go where things lead us, within limits, within very strong limits, but nonetheless there's strength to it. So one of the things that I work on, and this is involved with my work in the Center for Creative Inquiry, is some teachings that Tartan Tulku developed that he's very specifically said are not Buddhist. They're based on a series of books, and the first one was called Time, Space, and Knowledge, so we just refer to it as the Time, Space, and Knowledge Vision, or TSK, since we have to shorten things in our culture. The TSK very much grows out of this sense that the range of the possible is infinite, and that you could explore at the deepest level the kind of fundamental ground of our being. And so time is totally fundamental to who we are. The fact that we exist in time, whatever that word "in" means when we apply it to time. The fact that we are embodied and therefore by definition exist in space and what that could mean. And the fact that we have a particular understanding of knowledge, which in the ordinary sense always tells us that knowledge is what the self knows, and that sort of exhausts the possibilities for knowledge. Now, if you had a conception of God, you could say, well, then there's what God knows. What about that? You know, doesn't that count for something? But a lot of people don't. So we need to find our own way of expanding the range of the knowable.
and the range of the capacity for knowledge to manifest in time and space. That's, to me, a very interesting set of possibilities for us in this culture. And it's one example, and others are surely going to develop and are developing, where people are trying to find ways of communicating this kind of deeper quality of bringing alive, or maybe you could say bringing alive the highest capacities that human beings have. And if you think of that as what meditation fundamentally is about, and certainly, you know, we've seen there's so many, just yesterday and today, we've seen you couldn't begin to encompass all the possibilities of what we understand in meditation, probably in one tradition, let alone across traditions. So I'm trying to go to this very basic level and say it's about bringing alive all of our capacities, including ultimately this capacity for realization of what it actually means to be a human being. And somehow that seems to me related to that cypress tree in the courtyard. Okay. So let's open it up for questions. Thank you. So let me ask first if there are comments that people would like to make up here on the panel. I'll give us first shot on what other people have said. I already did some of that, so anybody? Okay, then we'll just open it up.
Actually, I can say one more thing. One of the ways that you can connect up, if you didn't get what I meant much about the asking yourself to what degree you're a terrorist, assuming that there are no CIA or FBI people. In any case, probably if you confess, it's not going to be acceptable in a court of law, so don't worry about it. Is that, what does a terrorist do? A terrorist is somebody who is causing suffering. So if you have studied Buddhism or meditated in a Buddhist tradition, you certainly recognize that to whatever degree you're not on, actually I was going to say to whatever degree you're not on the Eightfold Path, you're causing suffering, but really it's to whatever degree you're not a Buddha, you're causing suffering, I would imagine. Is that true? Okay, so this is, if you're causing suffering, you're a terrorist, all right? I guess I could round you all up and get a big bounty right now from the Bodhisattva police. Yes.
I have what Islam is the least familiar to me. Okay. I grew up in Taiwan. Okay, so I had exposure to Buddhism, Christianity, but not Islam. So what in today's world, it seems to me there is a lot of difficulties between Islamic world and the rest of the world. Why is that?
One confession that I have to make is actually Islam was the very last religion that I studied. I'd studied all the world's major religions and practiced. At the time, actually, I was practicing Tai Chi. I had done Zen, Vipassana, Tibetan Buddhist meditation. I had been a Kundalini yoga teacher, and so on. So we have a bit in common. Now, you mentioned that you know that Islam seems to be causing a lot of problems.
No. I don't mean that. I mean that there seem to be tremendous difficulties
Yes.
between the Islamic world and the rest.
Yes.
Why?
Okay, there are a couple levels that we can answer that question from. The easiest, well, actually, we could go at the level at which the newspapers answer it, look at kind of various political, historical issues. That's the least interesting to me, but I can do that. That's what I do when I teach. The most interesting level is what can we do to increase the likelihood that we will have the greatest wisdom in understanding this issue that you've brought up. What can we do now to increase our wisdom and increase our understanding? And so, anytime we think about an issue like the one in which there are tremendous problems that we're experiencing in our world, and a lot of those problems have to do with Muslims versus the West. So when we think about an issue like this, we experience discomfort, whether it's our own personal discomfort, whether we are sympathetic to people that are either victims of injustice or experience suffering caused by that injustice. Right now, we are having these thoughts. Right now, we're experiencing tastes. Even though you're not being a victim, bombs aren't being dropped on you, you're not being shot at, nevertheless, you're thinking about that. And those thoughts are causing certain impressions in you, uncomfortable feelings, uncomfortable thoughts. And so the question is, how do we respond to that to increase the likelihood that we will have the greatest wisdom about how to respond to ourselves and to other people? And so here, this is where we come back to the meditative attitude. And it may sound a little facile, a little easy, but there really is one solution at the root, and then out of that, to the degree that we can respond to what our consciousness is experiencing right now, this moment, to the degree we can respond to that with unconditional gratitude or unconditional openness, this increases the likelihood that we will be receptive to finding wise solutions to problems in our world and to how we have to conduct our life. So that's in answer to your question, the best shot that actually you have at answering that particular question and improving the quality of life of the whole planet is right now responding to what you're receiving with your senses, responding to that with as much openness as you can bring to it. And part of what can facilitate that is realizing that you don't have another moment necessarily. We may all be dead one instant from now. And when that kind of sharpens our attention, like deadlines sharpen your attention, well, we have a deadline. And the deadline is right now. To whatever degree we're not aware of that deadline, we'll kind of slack off a little bit, you know. I mean, I'm from California, I slack off. Georgia, slack off. But if we recognize the deadline is right now, this kind of sharpens our attention. This is it. Are you a Buddha now? Are you a terrorist? Okay, now you have another chance. Were you enlightened at the last moment? No. Well, now let's go for it.
maybe I can broaden that out just a little bit too, beyond the Islam of the West issue. If you actually look at a very early stratum of Buddhist literature, there's a group of texts in a collection called the Sutta Nipata. And this is a collection that, for various reasons, scholars have determined, based on practical issues, this kind of thing, this is probably some of the very earliest Buddhist material. And it's quite interesting to look at what the Buddha's message is here, because this predates, I think, a lot of his systematizations of the tradition into all these numerical categories that we usually use in talking about Buddhism: the Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, 4 stages of meditative absorption, all of these sort of rubrics that Buddhists developed to kind of memorize what was essentially an oral tradition as it was passed down. So this is very early stratum. In this particular text, this section of the text, the Buddha's real focus, and his sole focus really, is the dangers that come from attachment and clinging. He says clinging is the source of all of our problems, because clinging, if we try to cling to things which in our world are impermanent, this brings suffering to us. That's a pretty obvious kind of one. But his real message is not so much the danger of clinging to the things of this world. He says the worst clinging of all is the attachment to views. This is the most virulent kind of attachment. And those who are attached to views inevitably are going to be coming into conflict with and fighting with their people who do not hold the same views. So he attributes really the entirety of much of the tension that we find in human society to this clinging that people have to their own personal point of view. And that's sort of what he really lays out as a way to sort of overcome that personal point of view, so that you can have a more expansive, kind of open perspective on things. And I think that's really, in many ways, the fundamental message of the Buddhist tradition, is how to learn to let go of your clinging to what you think to be right, so that you open yourself to a broader, more all-encompassing perspective on things.
Okay.
So I have an example of something I'm clinging to. So I'd love to hear the process about what to do with it. And that clinging is, so I feel a lot of discomfort when I picture an Islamic family, probably from the Middle East, that is not able to ride bicycles together as a family because the woman is not allowed to do that, to ride bicycles. Or the woman is, wearing so many clothes that she does not get enough vitamin D. These are things that cause me discomfort. So what's the process to?
Yeah. Just to tie one more thread together before I make the connection to what you were just saying. Just like we're suffering from existential indigestion, we're also suffering from existential anorexia. Even though we think we're getting a lot to eat, we're actually extremely anorexic. So we need to learn how to eat existence in that sense. So now, how do you eat? How do you use this as a meal, as an existential meal? In order to somehow benefit this woman, the hypothetical Muslim woman or family. Right at this point, I'm assuming you don't know, do you know a woman like this? Okay, but there's probably a woman out there. You don't know her. What can increase the likelihood that you will be able to respond in a compassionate, constructive way that will benefit her? Going back to again, it might seem like I'm repeating myself, but as you think about her, now, and you feel your own discomfort, the way to increase the likelihood that you will find the wisest solution to how you personally can help her, the way to increase the likelihood that you will have this wisdom based on who you are, is right now to be open to what you are thinking and feeling, to receive that and digest it in your own consciousness. And in Sufism, the way to do that is by gratitude. First step. Christians speak about love. Muslims also speak about love, but gratitude is a beginning of love in Islam. Love is fairly elevated. If you know how to love, then love. When you have an experience like that, then love that unconditionally. If love is a little bit 12th grade and we're extremely, what do you say, agapeic anorexic, then start with, just stay with the feeling. Be aware of this situation, your thoughts that you're having around it. And if you believe in God, recognize, try to respond to God with unconditional gratitude for ultimately having brought this situation about. From a Sufi perspective, nothing comes into existence or it goes out of existence except through God. And even everything is a name of God. Everything, every thought, every feeling. So that's that. If you start there, that will increase the likelihood that you will get your synapses going, speaking scientifically, and be led to the best possible, will increase the likelihood that you will be led to the best possible solution for yourself in that situation.
Okay, there's a question here. And then-
Now that he's speaking of me,
Yeah.
of synapses and what you said about the mind versus the brain, I have a question. That I think in Catholicism they said the word and God, the concept and God comes, so it's a concept. And today we hear a lot about the brain, but the concept is, you were saying, is in the mind. And the relation, if I heard you well, said the mind is where you start to change the synapses, to rearrange the synapses. Is that understanding correctly what you said? Trying to
Well,
part of.
yes, see, I have to switch because I thought you were going to ask a question about it.
So yeah,
So I was saying that was what the neuroscientist, who was a major worker in this field of Richard Davidson said in response to what many other neuroscientists say, which is that the mind is just the brain functioning. And you notice he was being very clever. Scientists can do that, in that he didn't deny what the others said. He just said, well, but the mind also affects the brain. And notice that not only do we have, each of us, our inner terrorist, and thank you for bringing that up. I had not thought of it in those terms before, and it's really very profound. We also have, at the mental level, our own inner reductionist materialist. Now, science need not be that way if it's taken as really creative, genuine, I don't know something. So I'm going to ask questions about it and I'll find something out. But too often it collapses into the sort of materialism that question and the response we're bringing up.
But the
Perhaps-
terrorism, wait, I mean, all of that, where does that live? In the brain or in the mind? That's the main difference. Is there a difference? You make a difference, or he makes a difference between the brain and the mind? Because one is the concept, and maybe the hardware or software kind of difference. That's the way you.
Well, from his point of view, or from either of their points of view, that is, the current science point of view is that, and the point of view, by the way, is quite literal. We now have gadgets, machines where you can look into the brain and you can see things happening, and where psychology is now totally gone to doing that and just looking at the brain, and everything that we do or think shows up in the brain moving in some way. So there's a current fascination with just mapping that. Eventually it will turn into, people will have mapped it and say, now what other kinds of questions can we ask that will help us be wiser by knowing this? So we have the issue of our thinking about terrorists, outside, and then I have one inside. And it's our mind that now says, oh yes, and let me feel into that, and what can I do with that thought? And something is also then, if you do that and do it with sincerity, something will happen in the brain. And if we do that kind of contemplation or any other kind long enough, we don't know how long, the brain will change in such a way that maybe something will happen. Maybe life will become meaningful in a slightly different way. Materialism, to get back to that, isn't the only kind. So from the Tibetan tradition, it's pointed out, we have materialism. We usually think of that as people wanting McMansions and Jaguars and more money than they possibly could ever use. But it also means seeing the world as only matter. And the kind of brainism that science is in right now is sort of I don't know, maybe a cult inside generalized materialism. Because, you do have the rest of the body, and all of the Eastern traditions, that there's an inner energy body that also affects us, and the brain goes back and forth with that. That's another, I'm just throwing that out in case anybody's interested. Aside from materialism, there is psychological materialism. So with our usual sense of materialism, you're trying to grasp and pile up material things. With psychological materialism, you're clinging to things that are a little more abstract, and where in order to feel safer, feel more like me, feel more like I know what's going on rather than opening to it and or appreciating it or opening and being grateful or opening to a knowing that isn't part of the whole system, to solutions that might emerge. The psychological materialism says, oh, I know that terrorist is out there and it's terrifying, and therefore we know what to do to be safe. We have to put up a barrier and prevent that outside one from coming from harming me. And it's all kinds of other things. It's my religion is right and the others are all wrong. And I know that, and that makes me feel like me and good and safe, and it also gives me people to be with. And then you have spiritual materialism.
Okay. Well, out of my creative inquiry,
It's fine, go ahead and ask your question, but let me say I've been derelict in my duty and we've actually run on a little bit long. So if you could keep your question kind of short, and then Matt, you did have your hand up, and then those will be our last two questions, okay?
Okay. Okay, my question is, in today's scientific view, or today's science, is mind encapsulated in this organ called the brain? And mind, of course, means, lots of things, not a lot, okay? For instance, our dreams, where do they come from? And all of that. So my question,
What's happening when you're thinking about that?
pardon me?
What's, when you're asking the question, okay, notice.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, what prompts me to ask that
Yes.
question is this notion of reincarnation in Buddhism, and also in other traditions too. What reincarnation basically means that our life does not begin at the moment when we were born, and our life does not end at the moment when we die, right? So,
Well,
is
yeah.
that
So, what you seem to be saying is, you use the word encapsulated, that just the brain seems small and contained, right, kind of imprisoned, whereas there's a sense, and this is an intuition that I think we all have, there's really something more extended about that, or
yeah, that
and
more
more
than that,
deeper,
actually.
and maybe it's not all here.
Actually,
maybe
it's
something's here.
experiential. Experiential.
right. Right.
I myself have, when I was attending, junior high in Taiwan, at the time there was a fad, about playing Ouija board. Ouija board in Taiwan, in Taiwanese version. Okay. And it's very strange. I personally experienced, the telling thing of that that activity. You know, so how to explain that?
Uh,
I think I may save you.
That's a whole other panel.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing, but there are
Okay.
just two things I'd like to say.
Please do.
Okay, and one of them is, yes, so I had a Tibetan teacher, and when they die, they are to, all the measurements of our Western medical science, stone cold dead, no brain functioning, no organ functioning, but their deeper mind goes into the heart center, and if students gather, this is the most profound thing imaginable. And so just that's where that question and science are hanging out, not together. But there's another story. There's a very old, he's around 90 now, a wonderful teacher in South and Southeast Asian Studies at UC Berkeley named Professor Jaini. And I was sitting in ages ago in one of his classes, and at the end of it, he said, it was a class in Buddhism, and the students were giving him a hard time about karma and reincarnation, and he said, it was the last thing he said, oh, look people, what do you believe? You believe that the mind comes from nowhere, that we're born from, there's nothing before, but in Western religion, you believe that then you can continue to exist for infinite time. And if you don't believe that, because you're not religious, you wish you could anyway. And he said, that makes no sense. If the mind can, it's completely illogical. If the mind can exist, or even you can imagine it exists forever, it has to have existed, or you have to imagine it exists forever before then, right? And so, and then the class was over, and I went away thinking, my God, he said something that is totally new. This is this cutting that, I had never thought of that before. And it didn't make sense to me. It does not, and I know of nobody, and I've asked lots of classes, does this, no Western person that I know has ever thought, when they consider life existing after death, they think, is it true or not? They don't think about that it's illogical to imagine that without a life before. And yet, for a lot of people from Asia, it makes perfect sense, exactly what Jaini said. And periodically, in the years following that, I check back, as I have more and more experience with Buddhism and so on. Does that make sense to me now? And it still doesn't. But it's alive whenever I think of it, which is not all the time. It hasn't turned into a koan. And see, it's the aliveness, if we want to call it that, the things that either opening to something or having something be so startling that you open even though you don't want to, that then put us actually in another state, another frame, another way of thinking of that woman, or one's relation to it, or of relation to oneself, or to religion, or to anything. So that's...
Okay, thanks. Well, Matt, I promised to give you the last question. So.
Do we have time? It's okay.
No.
It's okay.
Okay.
Let's hear it.
Well, I was actually just going to ask it. It seems in my experience that in the West we're inheriting a language for talking about meditation largely from Eastern traditions. And I only recently discovered the writings of Thomas Merton, and I was raised Episcopalian. But I'm now studying Buddhism pretty actively. And so I was just wondering if you had any kind of comments or insights on how, first off, how do we start to translate the monastic contemplative traditions that have existed in the Christian tradition into more lay communities? Is that something that seems much more viable for Catholics versus Protestants? And also, what kind of contributions do you think that the Christian tradition uniquely can make to the dialogue in our culture that's developing around meditation and contemplative practice and mindfulness and all of these different things? What are kind of the unique contributions for our own cultural inheritance that we may or may not know that we have in your experience?
Well, thanks for asking such a simple question. First of all, like I said before, one of I think the tragedies within Christianity, at least in the West, and I think when you're talking about the Orthodox Eastern churches, it's a different story. But in the West, there really was kind of a wounding that happened with the Reformation and with modernity. And so there's a level on which the contemplative tradition in the West had a period, really, I would say about 400 years, some people say longer, of arrested development. I mean, even in the monasteries, which is historically where the contemplative tradition has been situated within Christianity, even in the monasteries, there was really a period of just what the monks that I work with, what they say is just of devotionalism. And what they mean by that is really almost like what you were saying about kind of the externalization. The externalization of God. God is an object out there that I am supposed to be devoted to, so it becomes very transactional, and it really, leaves the soul, to use Christian language, untransformed. The contemplative process is really meant to be a process of the transformation of the soul. The Greek endpoint, as you were talking earlier about enlightenment, within Christianity, the Greek word for the endpoint is theosis, which basically means participation in God. In the Genesis story, we are created in the image and likeness of God. And so the idea is that, and this is in the New Testament, I mean, it doesn't get preached, on Sunday mornings, but the New Testament very clearly states that we are the body of Christ, we have the mind of Christ, and that we are partakers of the divine nature. And it's that kind of transformation that the Christian contemplative tradition seeks to open up with, situated inside us, and not so much about this devotion to this externalized object outside. Thomas Keating, the Cistercian monk, says that the original sin is forgetting that we are the image and likeness of God. That is how he understands the kind of the mythic concept of the original sin. Now, your second question, which is a much, much larger question, what can Christianity bring to the table, so to speak? And I think at this point, Christianity still has a lot of work, again, Western Christianity still has a lot of work to do to excavate its own tradition. And that's probably, for those who are practicing Christians, I would say really the most important thing that we can be doing. I mean, obviously, being in conversation with dialogue partners from other traditions is very, very important. But there's just, there's so much out there. I mean, just take, the 99 sermons of Meister Eckhart. I mean, any one of them will blow your mind. Those need to be brought into the churches and into the monastic retreat houses, and we need to be, engaging in Lectio Divina on these sacred texts and trying to bring them alive today in our lives as practicing Christians before we can even begin to sit down with our Buddhist and Muslim and Jewish and Vedantist and any other tradition brothers and sisters and say, hey, wow, check this out. So I think that's really the most important thing that Christians can be doing is, trying to really kind of reclaim the treasures that really have been dormant for quite some time. So, thanks for
Thank you.
So that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you everybody for coming. There are refreshments outside, and we'll start, it's almost 3 o'clock, so let's say we'll start at 3:15 for those of you who are staying for the the workshop. And again, the leaders of practices in these different traditions will be Carl McColman and Robert Buswell and Alan Godlass. And that'll take place downstairs. People will be available to point you in the right direction, but your noses should lead you to the refreshments right now. They're outside. So again, thank you.